Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Good evening, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the concluding part of our battle, Pearl Harbor week. And we are talking about what happened after Pearl Harbor, which was the Battle of Coral Sea. Well, there were other things in between that we will explain later. And then the Battle of Coral Sea led to Midway. And I'm reminding folks right away that we've got links in the description below to our Kokoda show we did with Dr. Carl James a few weeks ago, and also our show with about Midway, about Shattered Sword we did with Anthony Tully and I forgot John Parshall back in whenever that was, July, I think that was. So my guest today is absolutely, I mean, when we're talking about people, historians with godlike status, I can't believe when I started this channel, I would get someone like today's guest on. I'm a prolific reader of his books. He has spoken at numerous places. There's all sorts of C-SPAN conferences online and lectures. He's taught at the Naval Academy, the Naval War College, and I'm delighted that he's with us today. I'm holding up my copy of his Battle of Midway book, which includes a chapter on the Battle of Coral Sea. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Craig Symonds. So good afternoon, Craig. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm well.
And I didn't realize, I said before we went live, I didn't realize I scheduled this on the day of the Army-Navy football game. So
yes, well, I'm not looking forward to that with much hope, I'm afraid. I think Army's got our number this year, but we'll see.
The football team I support in England, they actually drew a match day. Normally we lose, so I know all about sporting failures to achieve. But anyway, we've got a lot to talk about tonight. So Pearl Harbor is what we've been talking all week. And of course, in the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, there's kind of two things going on in the USA. There's the grieving and the shock that the general public are going through, and the world is reeling in the awe of the attack. But the US Navy and the War Department generally are turning their attention to what to do next. So before we get into the Battle of Coral Sea, what were the very first moves beyond Pearl Harbor to take the US Navy forward and recover from this, you know, seemingly tragic event?
Well, it wasn't seemingly tragic. It was genuinely tragic.
Yeah.
But I will say that it was a shock, and I think shock is the right word to use here. The plan that the U.S. Navy, and for that matter the U.S. government, had put together for what would happen in case of a war with Japan, called Plan Orange, had been on the books, so to speak, since the early 20th century. 1911 was the first version of this plan, and the outline of it very simply was the assumption that the Japanese would attack American forces in the Philippines. And in response to that, the battle fleet would congregate at Pearl Harbor and strike out across the Pacific Ocean to meet up with the Japanese fleet somewhere, perhaps in the Philippine Sea, to fight the naval battle that would decide the outcome of the war. Well, all of that was thrown into a cocked hat immediately with the destruction of the battle fleet at Pearl Harbor, which was exactly what Yamamoto had in mind when he urged it on the naval command decision makers in Tokyo. The idea was to knock those battleships out of the war for 6 months, to buy the Japanese time to consolidate their gains in the South Pacific, Borneo, Java, Sumatra, Malaya, what is now Indonesia, French Indochina. That's where the resources were that the Japanese needed to carry on the war. So the idea was to prevent the United States from interfering with those moves. It would knock that fleet out for 6 months. Then they would gobble up those resources and then defy the United States to come back. They never really expected to win the war outright. They expected to discourage the Americans to the extent that the Americans would agree eventually to negotiate. And after that negotiation, the Japanese would emerge with their conquests in the South Pacific and essential economic autarky.
And the thing we always want to remind our viewers is of course, Pearl Harbor is happening concurrently with the other events in Singapore and Malaya. It's the strike everybody has been fearing, and now it's happening. And of course, the international dateline means that we consider the events happening the next day, but they're effectively happening at the same time. And we've got people who got up early in Australia to watch this. And Dean was saying earlier how it's a very important day in Australian naval history as well today, because, you know, we will talk about that later, is that it was both forces, US Navy and Australian forces in this battle. And as we go through the Pacific, the British Navy, of course, involved in lots of these encounters as well. But this time, making sure we bring the Australian force into the story there. But the other thing about Pearl Harbor that we need to address as well is that the tragic loss of those battleships also kind of forces the US Navy to change or the way warfare is going to a carrier-based warfare. And when we get to talking about Coral Sea later on, I mean, it's interesting that, you know, no surface gunfire between those ships. So, you know, as the eminent US naval historian, do we think that the battles that we now know that were carrier based, how would they have evolved had the battleship fleet not been destroyed there? Would there have been more surface to surface action, do you think, or was it always destined to move towards a carrier based conflict?
Well, there are three questions embedded in that.
Yeah,
and let me address them one at a time. The first one is the role of the Australians, and for that matter, the Allied forces generally in the Pacific. With the destruction of the American battleship fleet at Pearl Harbor and the near simultaneous destruction of the two capital ships that Britain had sent to the South China Sea for the defense of Singapore, the Japanese pretty much had control of naval activities in the Western Pacific. And so what the Allies did was try to congregate the forces they had left into a genuinely combined command force called ABDA, the American, Australian, British, and Dutch forces in the South Asia. We don't want to forget Holland. They were involved in this too. They'd been overrun by the Wehrmacht in 1940, but their colonies still had a pretty significant surface naval force in what were then called the Dutch East Indies. So this ABDA command that included the Australian Navy, significant portions of it, including some heavy cruisers, tried to fend off these Japanese thrusts that we can see on this map, those red lines moving south. And they did not have a happy time of it, fighting in the Battle of the Java Sea and then the Battle of the Sunda Straits, both in February of 1942. The ABDA command was all but annihilated by the Japanese. They were simply too dominant in the South Pacific area for the ABDA command to stand up to them. Now, with the destruction of all those battleships, you suggest that maybe this gave further impetus to the idea that carriers were about to become, and in fact did become, the principal striking arm of modern navies, modern, that is, as of the Second World War. And that's absolutely true. I'm not sure that would not have happened anyway. Right. When Admiral Nimitz arrived on New Year's Eve, 1941, to take command of what was left of the Pacific Fleet, he looked around and said, you know, this isn't as bad as it thinks. Yes, the Japanese sunk 4 battleships. They damaged 3 others, plus a target ship, which could be called a battleship, the USS Utah. And that's not a good thing. But the good thing is that the American carriers were not in Pearl Harbor that day. And the reasons for this have been seized upon by those who love conspiracy theories, that somehow the Americans knew this was going to happen and so they got the carriers out of the way. That is absolutely incorrect. But the circumstances were such that the Saratoga, one of those carriers, had been sent to Bremerton in Washington for a scheduled refit. That was already on the books. Another, the USS Yorktown, had been sent from the Pacific to the Atlantic, where the U.S. Navy had joined with the Royal Navy to fight an undeclared but nevertheless very real war against German U-boats. So the Yorktown wasn't there. The other two, the two that were left, Husband Kimmel, in command at the time, sent them both off to reinforce 2 American outlying bases, one at Midway, north of Hawaii, and the other at Wake Island, west of Hawaii, in response to a war warning sent out from Washington on the 26th of November saying, war can be expected at any minute, get ready. And to get ready, he sent those 2 carriers off to reinforce with an additional airplane squadron those 2 outlying bases. So on December 7th, 1941, there were no U.S. carriers in Pearl Harbor. And Yamamoto knew immediately that that was, for him, an extremely unfortunate thing. I think the idea that carriers had a greater reach, a greater striking power than battleships was pretty well known, and the destruction of the battle fleet probably further encouraged that, but I suspect it would have happened anyway.
It just perhaps advanced it at a greater speed, but the world was moving that direction anyway. And we talk about it often on this channel, is that in the early years of the war, everybody's going through a very, very steep learning curve. They're understanding that the war is not perhaps going to be fought the same way the previous one was, and everyone's getting up to speed with exactly how it's going to unfold. But the other thing I want to bring up before we get into the actual battle itself is the importance of code breaking and SIG-INT, or signals intelligence generally, because the big battle everyone talks about, Midway, is where that really came into its own. I think it's left people with an idea that it's a perfect science. And of course, it can be very, very useful. But one of the things that we will talk about today with the Battle of Coral Sea is that it can also lead to misinformation, decisions being perhaps made too quickly, and simply just errors, and errors of decryption, errors of transmission. And I think it's important to kind of understand that in this early stage of the war, this science that will go on to be incredibly important is still sort of got teething problems. So talk about what the US Navy has at this point in regards to naval intelligence, and what they kind of think the Japanese are up to, and how that has an effect on the battle, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, radio intelligence is absolutely central to both the Coral Sea and to Midway, and for that matter, to the entire Pacific War.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. There's the old line that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, but a little knowledge was all the Americans were getting out of those radio intercepts that were decrypted in the basement of the Naval District Headquarters building in Oahu. When we say that the Americans broke the Japanese code, boy, oh boy, there's a lot of ways to break that down. First of all, there's more than one code.
Yeah.
The code that the Americans had access to prior to Pearl Harbor was the diplomatic code, sometimes called purple or magic. And they were able to read pieces of that, enough of it that they knew the Japanese were planning something. They knew the Japanese were going to strike southward. They knew that the Dutch East Indies were a target. They knew a lot of this, which is why they sent out that war warning to Pacific commanders saying, the war may start at any minute now. Get ready. There's a newspaper headline that I like to show my students at the Naval Academy from a week before Pearl Harbor, where the headline in the Honolulu newspaper says, Japanese may strike this weekend. But of course, the assumption was they would strike south,
yeah,
not at Pearl Harbor. So we had broken enough of the diplomatic code to know that war was coming. We had not broken the operational code known as JN25, and the particular iteration by now is JN25B, sometimes called the 5-number code. Now, afterward, after Pearl Harbor, the American cryptanalysts jumped on that and worked literally 24 hours a day to try to crack into this thing. And by the early spring of 1942, they were reading just snippets of it, just enough to get hints that what the Japanese were up to might lead them into the Coral Sea. The American who supervised this effort was a lieutenant commander named Joseph Rochefort. And Joe Rochefort found a repeated reference in these Japanese radio messages to the letters M-O, which he decided meant Port Moresby. And he had seen it elsewhere, and he passed that information up the chain to his boss, who is Admiral Nimitz. And it's Nimitz who makes the decision that, yes, I'm going to believe you. I'm going to trust that estimate, and I'm going to send my carriers into the Coral Sea to try to stop the Japanese from this amphibious assault on the Australian port of Port Moresby on the south coast of New Guinea. So that decision which was pretty bold to make at the time, assumed that Rochefort knew that his guess was right and that he took the risk to send those carriers, which of course are with the loss of the battleships, are his only striking arm available, to send those carriers into the Coral Sea.
And it's probably a good time now to mention some of the figures we're going to be talking about. I've put two Japanese and two American, and I know from reading your book, you're a big fan of, or you appear to be a big fan of Jack Fletcher, certainly within the Coral Sea engagement, and other historians have had other views over the years, and obviously the historiography of battles like Coral Sea and Midway has changed over the years as people have come in and out of fashion, in a sense, in terms of history. But the interesting thing is some of these commanders are good at understanding carrier tactics, some aren't, some are sort of relying on other people. And there's also this command issue, because we've got Fletcher there, and we also want to talk about Fitch as well, because he has this role that isn't really he's there, but he's not in command, but he is in command. So explain a little bit about how he ended up, his role in this battle, because it is a little bit complicated to understand, isn't it?
It is a little bit. I mean, the command structure, particularly in 1942, that carries out throughout the war, but becomes somewhat modified once the United States has many more carriers in 1944. But certainly in 1942, it's called a task force. Now, a task force consists of one aircraft carrier, generally, occasionally two, but usually one, an aircraft carrier, probably two, sometimes three cruisers, and 5 or 6 destroyers. The purpose of those ships is to provide anti-air protection and anti-submarine protection to the carrier itself, plus at least 1, maybe 2 oilers, which are needed to keep all those ships fueled up. People tend to overlook the importance of logistics, but when you're operating in the Pacific Ocean, literally thousands of miles away from a friendly base, the ability to refuel at sea, to resupply at sea, to keep these ships moving is critical. So those oilers are very important. I know you want to talk about that later as well.
We'll come up with that later on,
with 4 task forces in the entire Pacific Ocean, Admiral Nimitz had to be very careful how to apportion them. The problem he has is that his senior admirals, with one exception, had most of their professional experience in surface ships, in battleships, in cruisers. They were known colloquially as black shoes, and Jack Fletcher is a black shoe. That is to say, he grew up commanding cruisers and battleships, and now he's in command of a task force. He doesn't command the carrier. There is a captain on the carrier who is the ship's captain. He is the task force commander. He's in charge of that whole group of ships, but he makes the strategic decisions about how to use them. Now, you had a picture of Fitch up there a minute ago, and I assume you can click it back on there. Fitch, you look on his uniform, he's got wings on his uniform. He's an aviator. He is a brown shoe. That is to say, he has multiple years of experience as an individual aviator and in command of aircraft carriers. He is not a task force commander. He commands the task force Lexington, but once it joins up with Fletcher's Yorktown, Fletcher is in overall strategic command, but Fitch commands the group of ships built around the Lexington. So there are 2 admirals in the Coral Sea, but Fletcher is the overall commander, and Fitch must respond strategically to Fletcher's decisions, although Fitch can make tactical decisions about how to use his aircraft. I hope that
made sense to me. And from the Japanese side, Hara he seems to be the key figure here, and he's another fascinating character, because when you're reading about, I find when I'm reading about the Japanese admirals, they do tend to kind of merge into one another because they don't seem particularly different in their personalities, but he definitely kind of stands out as being a little bit different. I mean, his nickname alone made him a bit interesting. So tell us a little bit about him.
Hara is an interesting guy. Americans would have called him a brown shoe. That is to say, he's an aviator. And in fact, his boss, because he, knowing that, essentially turned over carrier command decisions to Hara. And he's in charge of the 2 of Japan's biggest and its 2 newest aircraft carriers, the Shokaku and the Zuikaku, which come around north of if you put that map back on again, we can get a sense of how he's approaching. He's coming around the north end of New Guinea and around behind the Americans. The dotted lines on the right-hand side of that map show something about his movements. So in a way, he's coming in behind the Americans, while the invasion force is actually coming straight down from New Britain, from Rabaul, to attack Port Moresby. If I had a crayon, I could show this a lot better, but you'll get the idea here. So there's the invasion force
there,
and the carrier force are operating separately, and the carrier force is considered a covering force for the invasion force. Its job is to fend off any attempt by the Americans to interfere with the invasion. And of course, interfering with the invasion is exactly what Frank Jack Fletcher has in mind. So this is going to lead to a confrontation between Hara's 2 big carriers and Fletcher's 2 big carriers in the Coral Sea. It's going to be the first battle in history carried out entirely by carrier-based airplanes, where the opposing fleets never actually see one another. But the object of the battle in the Coral Sea is to convince the invasion force to call off the invasion of Port Moresby. So there's nothing that actually happens at Port Moresby. Nevertheless, that's the object for which the 2 fleets are contending.
And how are the Japanese approaching this battle in the sense that they've spent a long time building up their plan to attack on Pearl Harbor? This is now several months later. They're spinning a lot of plates at this point because they're expanding their empire. They've got all these logistical concerns with running supplies everywhere over a massively large area. So how are they approaching this? For a start, for the benefit of the viewers, do they even want to get involved in a naval engagement, or is it all about getting Port Moresby? Would they rather kind of treat these things separately, or are they happy to have it all happen at the same time?
Well, curiously, the answer to that is both of the above. Yes, right. I think Port Moresby is the objective. They're going to consolidate this resource base that they will later call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And to consolidate that, they want to capture Port Moresby to hold all of New Guinea. There are 2 ways of getting there. One is to go overland, over the top of the Owen Stanley Mountains from the north coast, which they hold, over the mountains to the south coast. But it's terrible environment. I mean, there are mountains and jungles and tough Australian jungle fighters. It just looks easier to go around the corner and land at Port Moresby by sea. And so far, everything has gone entirely their way. Their schedule is way ahead of pace. They have wiped out Abda. They have taken Malaya and Borneo and Siam, Thailand, if you would. And it's all been relatively easy. So they have a bit of what's sometimes called victory disease. That is, they believe this is going to be fairly easy. And if the Americans get in the way, well, so much the worse for them. But if they do get in the way, Japanese confidence is such that it will be easy to sweep them aside and complete this invasion. So, yes, the invasion is primary. Excuse me. But if the opportunity arises to destroy more of the American fleet, all the better.
I mean, that's a very good point you made, because we've done a lot of shows on this channel where we're talking about the latter part of the war, where, as a rule of thumb, the Allies are the confident side and the Japanese are less confident. This is still in that part of the war where the Allies are feeling their way through rather cautiously because of the disasters we've had. Singapore, for example, has is going to be an incredible crisis, as Pearl Harbor was for the USA. So we're feeling our way forward tentatively. We also, as the Allies, don't have the strength in depth to be ridiculously confident at the moment. We're short of things, so we have to play to bring the football analogy in. We've got to play a rather safe game at this moment. And the Japanese are playing the confident one, and it changes later on in the war. But I wanted to bring in the idea of the Oilers, because when we did a show on Monday, and Drakenifel the 10 points he made about Pearl Harbor. One of the key points he made is that they didn't lose the Oiler in Battleship Row there, and how important it was. And you mentioned it yourself there, because again, for those who forget how enormous the Pacific is, it's thousands of miles from Pearl to the Coral Sea here, and being able to refuel these carriers is absolutely essential. So in the period before the battle goes on, commences, that early May period, it's absolutely vital that the Americans have these tankers with them, isn't it? And what would you like to sort of share about the importance of that? Because I've even got a photo here of the Yorktown being refueled there. So as someone, you appreciate logistics like all proper historians do, and logistics are the backbone of it. So just explain just how vital this ability was to refuel.
Yeah, there are two major shortages that the Americans have, Nimitz in particular being in command of the Pacific Fleet, in dealing with the Japanese. One is destroyers. He doesn't have enough destroyers. It turns out later that the submarines also could be included in that, because nobody knew at the time, but it turns out that their torpedoes weren't working. So those are two critical shortages. But the oilers in particular, I think, deserve an asterisk by their name, because you mentioned the Japanese failure to sink an oiler in Pearl Harbor. More than that, on Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, they failed to hit the storage tanks of fuel on Makalapa Hill behind the submarine base. And all of that oil had to be brought by tankers from California. Let's make sure everyone understands the distinction here. Tankers carry large supplies of oil to Hawaii or to any forward base, but oilers actually accompany the fleet and refuel it, as we see here on screen, at sea in what's called UNREP, underway replenishment. It's a process, a protocol. The refueling of carriers at sea had not even been seriously attempted until 1939. So this is a fairly new process. And as you say, the distances in the Pacific are vast. Keep in mind, the distance between Honolulu and Tokyo is 6 times greater than that between London and Berlin. Yeah. So the European theater, big as it is 1/6 the size of the Pacific theater. And to keep those ships active and underway, thousands of miles from a friendly base, oilers are crucial.
So, well, thank you for that. Let's talk about that period before the battle. And I'm going to apologize to folks who haven't seen this map yet, because it does look like someone has just thrown squiggly lines at a blue board there, but it is a little bit complicated. Hopefully Craig will be able to make sense of it, because we're seeing several dates on that map. Sure. We're seeing 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and even 9th on that map. So if you can kind of run us through how the sides deploy in these early stages there. And I think one of the things when we get through the stages is the key things I've written down in my notes here is kind of, we're talking about fairly equally matched forces generally going into this battle. We're talking about some SIGINT and some intelligence that is not always perfect, decision making that is happening kind of on the fly, and definitely cases of mistaken identity. And again, I think for people who understand the Midway battle, Midway does seem, when you study it now, the pieces seem to fall into place in the right slots, and it all looked like it was going kind of to sequence. The Coral Sea battle has a real complicated nature of both sides getting things right and wrong, and luck coming involved there. And for that reason, it is a fascinating battle. So lay us out how the two sides first deploy.
Sure. You think this is complicated, by the way? Never mind. That's a joke.
Well, I'm a ground historian. I mean, I spend my time walking through the fields of Normandy. So anything that happens on the sea is by nature to me complicated.
All right, let's start out at the upper left there. You see the solid red line coming down from Rabaul. That's the invasion force. That's the force that's supposed to sneak through that group of islands and attack the southern coast of New Guinea at Port Moresby. You see that it turns around, and it turns around near the spot where says sunk Shoho. That's a small Japanese carrier, not a big one, but a small one that's accompanying the invasion force. That's important, as it turns out. But on the right-hand side of the screen, you see that dashed line coming around the corner there. It says 5 May, and then a little later on, as you follow it into the center of the map, it says 6 May. Then it turns south and turns around again and zigzags back and forth. These are the two carriers that Hara is managing, These are the Shokaku and the Zuikaku. So the Japanese two forces, the solid line on the left, that's the invasion force. The dotted line on the right, that is the covering force of the two carriers. We're going to ignore that dashed dotted line in the middle there for a while. That's the force that goes to Tulagi to set up a airplane base, a seaplane base. So we'll ignore that for now. Now, the black lines are the Americans. And you see a dashed line coming in from the right-hand side of the map. That's Fitch coming from Pearl Harbor. Nimitz has sent him down there to join Fletcher, who is the solid black line. And Fletcher decides to head north. You see the line going up to Fort May, and he launches that airplane attack at the Japanese invasion force at Tulagi. Once he does that, the Japanese know he's in the vicinity. This is the first time they appreciate now, oh, there's an American carrier here. In fact, there are two American carriers here, but he does not know that yet, and he does not know where they are. And Fletcher does not know where the Japanese carriers are. So imagine a game of blind man's bluff, both wearing blindfolds as they enter into a darkened room, and they're groping for one another. They're sending out patrol squadrons, trying to find the other. And so that is what happens during the period you indicated there, from the 4th to the 6th of May, the two coming together in a darkened room. I see Peter O'Connell has sent in a note, a bar fight with the lights off. Actually, that's usually used to describe the naval battle of Guadalcanal, which comes a little bit later, but it's not a bad description of what's happening here too.
Yeah, I mean, it is complicated. And I've kind of blown up that section there where we're talking about the flight there on Tulagi, which was in itself was a successful mission, isn't it? I mean, they went in there, except again, they didn't quite find what they were expecting to find there. And that seems to be a recurring theme through this of forces going out and then the information about what they're finding being different and then relayed different in transmissions. It's a fascinating insight into the things that can make a battle turn, but not necessarily the right way, if that makes sense. I can't get my words out there.
One of the factors involved here is that the pilots on both sides, I should say, but in this particular case, in the strike on Tulagi, American pilots tend to exaggerate how successful they've been. This is a human nature. They drop a bomb, they see a big explosion, the ship moves or tilts or it looks like it's smoking, and they report back, I've hit a cruiser or I've hit a whatever. The damage actually against the Japanese in the strike on Tulagi is fairly minimal. They sink one ship, they damage a couple of others, but they report back that they've conducted this tremendous slog against the Japanese. And this is true on both sides, and it's going to play a role in the big carrier battle when it finally takes out, because planes fly out, they see something, they report it back, it's misunderstood. We see the two planes sort of in the left-hand side. They're big airplanes coming from Australia, those big 4-engine ones. Those are Army planes. The problem with Army planes is that the pilots don't really know what they're looking at. There are ships down there. Well, what kind? Well, I'm not really sure. They're sort of long and they have a pointy end and so on. So the American planes going out kind of from the middle of the screen up to the upper left toward the Shoho, those planes are identifying the enemy as well. And so there's confusion about who's where. They see a carrier, they go after it. It turns out to be a small carrier, the Shoho. It's an important attack because it helps convince the invasion force to turn around. But it's not the big carriers. We haven't seen those yet. You can see the black solid line kind of turning around, going south, then east, then south again. He is still looking for where those carriers are. And the Japanese are still looking for the American carriers. They both find each other on the same day, the 8th of May.
And I think we should mention as well that the Japanese Carrier 5 force is inexperienced as well, isn't it? These aren't the very best of the best that we think of from the first raid on Pearl Harbor, and so both sides are still finding their feet in just how this type of aerial warfare is going to run. I mean, when we get again to later in the war, both sides have built up some experience. They've had game time before, but this is largely most people's first event of this size, and it's over an area that navigation is difficult. Mistake, as you said, there recognition of enemy forces, indeed recognition of your own forces, plays into this as well. And we're asking a lot of these people. Again, when we think about the battles that seem to fall into place very, very well, we give sometimes these pilots this sort of superhuman ability, but often, cloud cover. I mean, even condensation on the cockpit glass of these aircraft going in was a problem. Even seeing through the fog and haze. There's lots of factors, human factors, that mean that these people are dealing with a situation that is hard to decipher.
I think that's fair to say. We've all heard of the fog of war.
Yeah.
You mentioned the fogging up of the windscreens on the dive bombers in particular, diving from 20,000 feet down to 1,500 feet to release their bombs. And in that climate and in that kind of descent at 70-degree angle, their windscreens would fog up and they wouldn't be able to see what they were doing. But keep in mind that the pilots, and for that matter, the ship drivers on both sides, did not have this map. We look at it now and say, well, why didn't he just do this? They don't know where anybody is. They're both groping through the fog and the dark. There's an actual moment late on the night of the 8th when Japanese airplanes, looking around for their carriers to land on, got into the flight pattern and tried to land on the American carriers.
Yeah.
And only at the last minute did either side realize, oh my gosh, that's not one of ours. So that's a measure of the kind of confusion you're likely to encounter in a battle that is this confusing. And by then, of course, it was nightfall as well, which does not help.
So, well, let's start with the 7th of the 7th, and we're also bringing in the Australian force as well, because they're out there with the cruisers, and we've got and the USS Chicago and the Canberra and the Australia there as well, and we've got Australian viewers there, so they're involved as well. So, kind of again, where is everybody on the 7th of May?
All right. Keep in mind that one of the ideas of of cruisers and destroyers in a task force setup is that they would ordinarily remain by the carriers to provide support, anti-air support in particular. But Fletcher's concern is that while he's looking for those Japanese carriers, the Japanese invasion force may get around the corner and get to Port Moresby unimpeded. So he detaches a significant surface force under the Australian Admiral John Crace. And that's the dashed and dotted line you see heading off to the left-hand side of the screen. That is heading west. You see the label there, detached 0630 on the 7th of May. There he goes off to cover the area through which the invasion force would have to go. So he's off there to the side. He's not close enough to the carrier to provide support for the Allied carriers, but the carriers aren't close enough to him to provide air cover for him. So it's a bit of a risk, but it's the only way Fletcher can see that he can put a block in front of the invasion force and continue to look for the Japanese carriers. Now, Crace has a bad time of it on the 7th of May for a couple of reasons. The Japanese attack him from the air, but so do the Americans. Airplanes from Australia see those ships down there. And again, these are Army pilots. They don't necessarily recognize which side they're on or even what kind of ships they are. They're operating under radio silence. And so the American bombers attack poor Crace's cruisers. And what's interesting about this, we talked about the confusion of battle and pilots' tendency to exaggerate. When the Japanese get back, they report that they've sunk 2 American battleships. And when the American planes get back to Australia, they report that they've sunk Japanese battleships. In fact, neither force from either side ever hit anything. And of course, Crace doesn't have any battleships anyway. So this is a measure of how difficult it is, particularly with high-level bombing. Dropping a bomb from 20,000 feet, you're unlikely to hit anything anyway, and usually you don't, or even to know what it is that you're bombing.
Yeah, and again, the pressures these pilots are under there. So let's talk about the loss of the oiler there, because this is significant, because again, the Japanese are going out on a report of what they think is going to be carriers, and as they're flying in, they still think it's carriers, and it turns out not to be. But this thankfully it had already done its refueling job, but this was a significant loss, wasn't it?
It was a significant loss, but not as significant as it could have been. You could almost consider this a stroke of good luck, because the Japanese scout planes are out there and they report back seeing an aircraft carrier and a cruiser. Well, of course, what it is instead is the Neosho oiler, a fleet oiler, and a destroyer. But when the Japanese admiral, when Hara, hears this, he sends off a full strike. Having sent off that full strike against the Neosho, it means he's not sending it off against Fletcher's carriers. So in a way, it's bad for the Neosho, and it's a blow to the Allied forces anyway, because the Neosho is, as we've mentioned, oilers are scarce, and the Neosho is one of only a few so-called fast oilers. That is, it can make 20 knots and keep up with the fleet, almost with the fleet. Most oilers can only make 10 or 11 knots. So the loss of the Neosho is pretty significant, but it does distract, if I can use that word, the Japanese from bigger fish.
We've had a question from Peter O'Connell there, referring back to Tulagi on the earlier day, but about the Fletcher's wisdom about attacking Tugali. Was it Tulagi? Was it the right thing to do? And again, we talked about the fact that he has come under some criticism from some historians. You're not in that camp. I mean, Fletcher's decision that day. What do you think was the reason behind it?
Well, the bad thing about it, we'll start with that, is that he exposed the fact that there was an American carrier force in the Coral Sea, which the Japanese did not know until that moment. On the other hand, it did inflict some damage on the Japanese ships landing troops at Tulagi. And I think one of the things often overlooked is it gave those carrier pilots experience in attacking Japanese forces from the air, dive bombing experiences. None of these pilots had ever launched a bomb in anything but practice, an active weapon on another ship. Here's the first time. And I think it's important that they all had that experience before they got into the big fight, the main event, if you would, with the two Japanese carriers. So my argument is it's a good thing to have done. Even if the impact on the Japanese was fairly modest, the value to the American pilots was pretty substantial.
And pilots, I suppose, feed on confidence, don't they? Generally, I mean, it's that every fighter pilot I've ever met, whether they're Navy or Army, there's that sense of just belief in themselves and confidence. And then when everybody's been out and had a flight that's had success like that, you all come back buzzing. And I suppose going into what happened on the 7th, that was a good state of mind to go into. So yeah, the morale aspect is always important, as well as the sort of tactical and strategic aspect, just how these young men are thinking, because
they felt great when they got back. There were lots of high fives and celebrating and hugs. My God, we landed a blow. We hit the enemy. We surprised them. They didn't expect it. We did some damage, and we got back mostly unscathed. That's pretty good.
Yeah. So back to the 7th again. Yeah, with there's the mistaken identity by the Japanese think it's carriers. They hit the Neosho, and then the American aircraft go out, and then we have this incident there where the smaller of the carriers is hit. So give it a bit of insight into how that happened.
Well, the initial report that Fletcher got was that this was the main Japanese carrier force. It was a misunderstood message. The transcription comes in code by radio, and he was one line off in transmitting the code. And what Fletcher understood was this was the main enemy battleship. So he sent everything he had after this. And then it turns out, no, it's not. It's just a small light carrier accompanying the invasion force. Well, they're already on their way. Let's do it. He vectors them toward that small carrier. So the Shoho, which we see here, is absolutely overwhelmed. Now, the pilots report that they hit it with something like 15 bombs and 19 torpedoes. That's absurd. It's not clear that any torpedoes hit it. It certainly was struck by multiple bombs, and it all but exploded in piece. It went down, losing most of its crew. It's the first major Japanese combatant vessel sunk in the war. So even though, yeah, it's a small carrier, and yeah, the American pilots exaggerated how badly they hit it, they did hit it, they did sink it, and it did convince the invasion force to turn around. So this is a significant accomplishment, but he being Fletcher, still has not found the main Japanese striking force, those two big carriers, which are somewhere out there.
Yeah, and this is, again, as you said, then you made the good point that none of these commanders had that map there. We can, as complicated as that map is, at least to me, perhaps not yourself, is they didn't have that benefit at all. And we're talking about scout planes going out. We're talking about carriers coming again. We're the misidentification, the miss sightings. It's a very complicated situation. We have got questions coming in here. It's a good time to do this one from Stephen Hill here. Would it have been beneficial to bring a composite of Lexington and Yorktown's air group to Midway now that they have fresh experience? Could they have combined to make a Yorktown air group?
Well, yes, they did. There was actually an argument about this. This is after the battle is over and they're deciding what to do. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. By saying,
just while it comes up in the sidebar before I lose it.
Yeah, with the loss of the Lexington and a crippling blow to the Yorktown, the Yorktown is now an orphan. And what should we do? Should we send it back to the United States? And Nimitz decides to patch it up quickly. But of course, many of its airplanes are lost. So where do we get the air group? Admiral King, who is actually Nimitz's boss, says, well, we should take all those airplanes and send them to shore bases to defend the shore bases. Nimitz says, no, these are carrier-trained pilots. They are the few people who know actually how to operate on a carrier. We need to use them for that. Let's take the airplanes from the Saratoga, which is still off being repaired on the West Coast, and put those airplanes on the Yorktown. So in a way, what you're suggesting, Stephen Hill, is pretty much what they did do. And I want to contrast that to what the Japanese decide to do. The Japanese lose a number of ships in this, a number of planes in this battle too. And they decide they can't send out a carrier because it doesn't have enough planes to constitute a strike group. The Americans say, oh no, we're going to take planes from a different carrier and put them on here. We'll cobble it together. The Japanese are so precise that they don't want to take planes from one carrier and put them on another. That interferes with their conception of the neatness of the task force. So as a result of that, their force at Midway is smaller than it might have been otherwise. So I think your insight is a good one.
I mean, we'll come to this toward the end of the show, but it's that the lessons learned at the Coral Sea battle were absolutely vital to how both forces went into the next big engagement at Midway, and it has that contextual interest as the gradual changing of ideas and thinking beyond just as a battle itself. And we'll get to your point that you make at the end of your chapter in your book later on about exactly who won it, or because I love the phrase you put at the last line of your chapter. We'll get to that later on, but let's bring it back to May the 8th again and try and again remind ourselves where we are on the map again, and so viewers can kind of have an idea of what's going on. So the day before, both forces have lost some of their vessels, but not who they necessarily think they were going to, and neither force is completely yet aware of where the others are. That's sort of a fair summary?
Yeah, that's a fair summary, and you can see them right in the middle of this map as the airplanes, the black airplanes going north, the red airplanes going south. They finally sight each other almost at the same time. And in fact, as the attack groups are heading, they actually pass one another in the air, which is an amazing thing. So the Americans are attacking the two Japanese carriers at the same time that the Japanese are attacking the two American carriers. And who gets the better of that? I think we have to say the Japanese do. And it's because Japanese pilots at this phase in the war are, frankly, the best in the world. They coordinate their attack between dive bombers and torpedo planes. And if American torpedoes do not work particularly well, Japanese torpedoes are superb.
Yeah.
So they are able to focus on particularly the Lexington, the biggest of the American carriers, built on the hull of a battleship. It's enormous, 42,500 tons displacement. And they hit it so many times that although it looks like it's going to survive, the fires burning out of control ignite secondary and tertiary explosions, and eventually the Lexington goes down. Now, the Japanese hit the Yorktown as well, but not quite as hard. It has a hole in its deck. It's got underwater damage to its hull, but it's still operational. And so the Japanese do a good job. Here we see the Americans abandoning the Lexington after the captain declares abandoned ship. Now, what do the Americans do to the Japanese? Well, as it turns out, one of the Japanese carriers is covered by cloud cover, so they can't see it. I think that's the Zuikaku. The Shokaku is in the open, and that's the one the Americans focus on, and they hit it hard. They hit it with 3,000-pound bombs. The American bombs are twice as heavy as the Japanese bombs, which are 550 pounds. So they hit it with 3,000-pound bombs. That might have been enough to sink it, but the Japanese are actually pretty good, on this occasion at least, at damage control, and the ship survives. No torpedoes hit it. Again, mostly because the American torpedoes are not working very well, but it is hit hard and it's taken out of the battle. So now the Japanese have just the one carrier. The Americans have just the one carrier, but each side decides, that's probably enough. And the Americans turn south and the Japanese turn north, and that's the end of the battle.
I mean, even the fact we have these photos is interesting, that the loss of the Lexington wasn't absolutely sudden. Thank God. It was here, as you say, there are these secondary explosions and things there, and the loss of life, although terrible, wasn't as terrible as it could have been. It was a couple of hundred as opposed to a couple of thousand, and and this is when it comes into, when we get to the assessing of the battle afterwards. These are important things to remember, isn't it? And it's not just the loss; it's who was being lost as well. In that, the Japanese, we know when we talk to other shows, they don't have the ability to wage a long war in the way the US have ability to wage war, in that they can't as easily replace their pilots. Frankly, the US hasn't even got going with its pilot training scheme really at full pelt yet. But within a year or two, you're producing pilots almost faster than you can allocate them to carriers. But the Japanese will not have that ability to recover from that. And the loss of their experienced people is significant there. So, these shots of Lexington are fascinating, and we've got some of the Yorktown there, the shot from the underside, the flight deck, and again, just an incredible photo that we have there. And there it is back in Pearl Harbor, a few weeks later. Of course, it was able to steam out a little bit later and join the Midway battle. But when we're looking up, we'll bring up on the image this chart here about the losses, because there's a lot we can take from that. There's a lot of takeaways from that. Because, as I say, we're talking about two forces that go into this reasonably equally sized, and their losses are, okay, the Japanese do inflict more losses on the US than the other way around, but it's not an overwhelming victory. But the line you come to finish your chapter is, it was a tactical victory for the Japanese, but a strategic victory for the USA and the Australian and Dutch forces. So kind of explain what you mean by that.
Well, first of all, I think this chart is a little bit misleading in that the one sunk carrier on Japan's side of the ledger is the Shoho, which is a small carrier. It's about half the size of the others. So in terms of fleet carriers, Japan's two big carriers both survive. One is damaged, but it goes back into the yards. It's repaired. It will fight again. The Lexington is sunk, and the Yorktown is damaged and has to limp back to Pearl Harbor. We saw it in dry dock being repaired. So in terms of major combatant forces, Japan's sinking of the Lexington just kind of trumps everything else in that chart. At the bottom of the chart, you see that the Japanese lose more airplanes than the Americans do. And that's significant. And it's particularly significant in light of the fact that Japan is less successful in rescuing their air crews, not just the pilots, important as they are, vital as they are, but also the air crews, the backseat flyers, if you would, in both the Cape torpedo planes and the Val dive bombers. The Americans, however, are much better at rescuing the pilots of the planes that go down. So here's the beginning of what you mentioned just a minute ago, of the fact that Japanese expertise in pilot experience is going to begin to drop. It drops here, it drops more at Midway, it drops still more during the Guadalcanal campaign, where the Americans' trajectory in available skilled pilots goes up and up and up. And you can almost chart that in your mind as the Japanese lose pilots and the Americans gain pilots. When those lines cross, the Japanese will never again be in a position to take on the Americans 1-to-1 and expect, as they did in 1942, to win.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. I think when you chart between Coral Sea and Midway, the two lines kind of cross. The Japanese ascendancy starts becoming a descent, and the American descent starts coming an ascent there. But you said something.
Here's the other half. Here's your question had two parts. That's one part. Here's the other part. Why is it a strategic victory?
Yes,
then?
Of course. Yeah.
I explained why it's a Japanese tactical victory. Why is it an American, an allied strategic victory? And the simple answer is that the invasion force turned around. Exactly. The objective in this entire battle is not just to sink the other guy's ships, it's to achieve your strategic goal, which is the protection of or the capture of Port Moresby. And when that invasion fleet turned around, objectives secured for the Allies. Port Moresby never did fall to the Japanese. And if you look at maps today and textbooks about the greatest expanse of the Japanese Empire in the Western Pacific, you see that line runs through the sort of middle of New Guinea, and Port Moresby remains an Allied jumping off point for a subsequent invasion for the rest of the war. So strategic object secured, strategic victory. Tactical victory for the Japanese because they sank the Lexington.
And that's because I think you've got that global view of this battle contextually that sometimes the Americans don't have. In that Americans sometimes in their understanding leap straight from Coral Sea to Midway, and they forget about the ensuing Kokoda campaign that we talked about earlier and all what's happened there with Australian forces there. And similarly, Australian forces who talk about that campaign, they bring in the Coral Sea battle, but then perhaps don't bring in Midway to their story because their trajectory kind of goes off down a different path there. And one of my recurring themes on this channel is to try and bring these nationalistic views of the campaigns together and overlap them more so that we're understanding these things in context. Because to me, New Guinea is one that Americans tend to look at the American aspect of New Guinea, and Australians tend to look at the Australian point of view and the contextual side of it. And particularly because you bring in the Solomon Islands as well into that, it gets a little bit lost off people's understanding there. But thank you for explaining about the tactical and strategic aspect. I'd like you to go back to something you said earlier about the efficiency of the Japanese forces going out when you're talking about the fighter cover, the torpedo bombers, and the dive bombers. Because in even just reading your chapter in your book on Midway about Coral Sea, you can almost feel the improvement of the American forces over those few days, going into over just a few days. So imagine what a few more weeks do to that, because you know, in reading your book, you know, it did seem that it was difficult getting the fighter cover at the same time as the dive bombers, and that's a very difficult thing to achieve. And do you obviously you think Coral Sea is incredibly important in the stepping stone of the US Navy getting those skills right, so they go into Midway with this ability to field their forces together better? Is that important?
Oh, absolutely. It's important. It's critical. And you can see it in both battles pretty clearly. Keep in mind, for those who aren't aware, every carrier has 4 squadrons on board. There is the fighter squadron, whose job it is to provide air cover for the task force and to accompany the bombers as protection for the bombers when they sortie to attack somebody else. So there's the fighter planes. Secondly, there's the bombing squadron. These planes usually carry 1,000-pound bombs, and they deliver these not from altitude, the way land-based planes tend to do, but by dive bombing on the enemy. They might start out at 15 to 20,000 feet and then dive down at usually about a 70-degree angle, and that's almost straight down if you think about it. And they accelerate. The speed accelerates as they go, and as you mentioned earlier, the windscreens might fog up. They're using the airplane as an aiming device, and then about 1,500 feet they pull on a lever that releases the bomb, which hopefully travels in the same trajectory that the plane was going, and the plane pulls out. But of course, as you pull that lever, there's a tendency for the plane's nose to come up a bit, so that the aiming protocols are very difficult. So that's the bombing squadron. The third squadron is the scouting squadron. Its job is to go out. Where is the enemy? What direction are they going? How strong are they? Let me report this back. But they also are a strike weapon. They tend to carry 500-pound bombs, sometimes two of them, sometimes one 500-pound bomb and 200-pound bombs. But they also can be a striking instrument, and their protocol is the same as the heavy dive bombers with the 1,000-pound bombs. And the fourth squadron on board is the torpedo squadron, which comes in very low, usually about 150 feet. They release that when they're maybe 2,000 yards away, and then peel off, and hopefully they aim that torpedo in. Now, what works best is when the bombing squadron's coming from above and the torpedo squadrons are coming from both sides. That makes it difficult, if not impossible, for the target ship to avoid all of that stuff. What happens in the Coral Sea, and again at Midway, is coordinating all of these so that the dive bombers, the scouting squadron, the torpedo planes, and the fighter cover all arrive at the same place at the same time and coordinate themselves. It sounds very easy in a textbook. It's very, very difficult to do.
Because again, forgive my lack of naval understanding, but theoretically, the larger and better Japanese carriers can outrun torpedoes at full speed. But then when they're dealing with bombers dive bombers coming in, you need to be slower because your anti-aircraft fire is more accurate. So the paradox is one type of attack coming in requires you to be faster, and one type of attack requires you to be slower. So therefore, as you're saying, if you bring them in at the same time, the enemy's stuck between the two options. Is that reasonable summary?
It's not bad. In addition to that, there's what the Japanese and the Americans both tended to call an anvil attack. You want those torpedo planes to be coming in from two directions at the same time so that the carrier can't turn away from them and literally outrun a torpedo or turn into them and comb the torpedoes and thereby bring about a miss. Because if you got torpedo planes coming in from both sides, you're turning into one either way that you go. And with the dive bombers coming from above, it creates an insoluble problem. But doing that all simultaneously is very, very hard.
Yeah. We have a quick question, and then I'll ask one of myself from C. Farnwhite here, saying, how would you rate Admiral Fletcher before and after the Battle of the Coral Sea?
Well, as has been mentioned, I'm kind of a fan of Frank Jack Fletcher. He gets a lot of criticism because he's a battleship commander commanding a carrier group, and he's just trying to figure it out as he goes. But it's because partly he's a guinea pig. He's the first guy to have to try to do any of this.
Yeah.
And the other problem is that he's in Admiral King's doghouse. Admiral King, the American Chief of Naval Operations, who's watching all this from Washington, had been disappointed when Fletcher didn't manage to get a rescue squadron out to Wake Island in time, and he has to turn around and come back. He thinks Fletcher is too concerned about logistic problems. Why is he refueling all the time? Why does he need to do that? Well, of course, King has not ever had an operational command in wartime, so he doesn't know the difficulties of some of these things. But for whatever reason, King has gotten into his mind that Fletcher's just not a warrior. And that's been picked up by historians over time. And I think it's a bit unfair. He's the first guy to try to carry this stuff off. He wins, I argue, strategically, the Battle of the Coral Sea. He wins the Battle of Midway. He is the supreme American commander at Midway, even though Spruance tends to get a lot of the credit for it. Fletcher is actually the guy in command. But he never quite gets out of King's doghouse for that. So I tend to give Fletcher a lot of credit. He's a kind of an old-fashioned sailor's admiral. You know, he's a bit profane. He's a pipe-smoking guy, talks with his hands a lot. I'm a fan. And Nimitz, by the way, was a fan as well, but King was not. And I think that was Fletcher's real problem.
Well, talking of King, because King is well known for not being particularly pro-British and pro-British relations. How, I know we're talking about the Australians here, but generally in this battle, how did the cooperation go between the US and Australian forces? Because of course, as the war goes on, we said it earlier, there's going to be lots more working side by side. It still is in its infancy here, but kind of in a nutshell, how did it go in the Coral Sea battle?
In a nutshell, both Australia and New Zealand subordinated themselves first to the ABDA command, and then to the American forces in the Pacific in a realistic recognition of the fact that they couldn't stand up to the Japanese by themselves. So that allying themselves closely to the Americans in a tactical as well as a strategic sense gave them more leverage against the enemy. When John Crace got orders from Fletcher, I want you to take your surface force over there and block the Jomard Passage, he didn't say, well, I have a different idea. He said, aye, aye, sir, and off he went. And that's simply the way it worked. Now, if we can jump ahead a little bit to Guadalcanal, I just want to make a comparison with Admiral Crutchley, who was a British Royal Navy admiral who was seconded to Australia, commanded an Australian group of cruisers off Guadalcanal. Nobody said anything about that. You have a British admiral under American command, commanding Australian cruisers in the Battle of Savo Island. And that was possible because the Australians and New Zealand commanders said, yes, we're all in this together and we're going to cooperate. Nobody stood up and said, well, I don't have to take orders from you. You had none of that.
I mean, and Crace just is fascinating because we always remind ourselves this is an away game for the US Navy, but it's a home game for the Royal Australian Navy. I mean, half of New Guinea is their territory. They are effectively fighting for the protection of their own country. I mean, there is a realistic threat of an invasion of Australia. So for them to go
don't overlook
to
the
US
Dutch.
command,
I think there's a great tendency to overlook the role of the Royal Dutch Navy in all of this. They are really fighting a home game, and they're fighting off their own beaches.
No, definitely. And then I think the next thing I want to bring up is we talked a bit about this misidentification, the use of naval intelligence, the code breaking. You know, Fletcher has been there and has now come out of this with this understanding that this is an important aspect. It's an important tool in his toolbox, but it's something that you have to be cautionary about. You can't take everything black and white. What are the significant changes in how they treat this kind of information in the next kind of 3 weeks before we get to Midway? Because to me, we don't talk enough about intelligence generally. We like to talk about people shooting at each other. It's essentially people kind of get excited by that, but this work behind the scenes is vital. So what changes did they make in that kind of next period to understand what the limitations are of this technology and what the benefits are of it?
Well, not only do we tend to overlook occasionally the importance of intelligence, we tend to overlook the fact that the intelligence community itself was often at daggers drawn with one another. The intelligence community in Washington believed that Rochefort should send all his information to them, and they should send their recommendations to Nimitz and to Fletcher and to others. Instead, Rochefort tended to tell directly to Nimitz, this is what I think is going on, and Nimitz would act on that. So within the intelligence community, the American intelligence community, there's already a bit of head banging going on. Now, as far as Fletcher is concerned, he actually has an intelligence officer on board who's supposed to be informing him about what the Japanese may be doing. And that intelligence officer thinks that Fletcher isn't paying enough attention to him. And that intelligence officer, whose name is Baird, sends that information back to Washington. That gets into Ernie King's ear and is another reason why Ernie King thinks, well, Fletcher's not really up to the mark here. But in fact, I think Fletcher was using the intelligence that Baird was providing and the reports coming in from his own scout planes and what he could see with his own eyes and amalgamating that to make his decision. So intelligence is critical, but it's not a magic bullet. It's not a case of where, oh, well, we know what they're doing, so we'll react accordingly. It's, I don't want to say a guessing game, that's too strong, but it's very much a case of applying what Nimitz like to call calculated risk.
Yeah.
I'm going to make a calculation here that this is likely to be so and respond to that, at the same time being sufficiently careful not to overcommit myself on the basis of what may prove to be false intelligence.
Yeah, no, very, very good summary there. And so as we slide things towards the end of the show there, for the people out there who've read more about Midway, and of course the people who've read more about Pearl Harbor, I mean, if you were having to sell the Battle of Coral Sea to someone to investigate it, why should we pay more attention to this battle if we haven't already covered it in the chat over the last hour? All
right, two reasons. One is I think it demonstrates the boldness of Chester Nimitz, who's the American Pacific Fleet commander. Remember, this takes place in May, early May of 1942, at a time when 2 of the 4 American carriers are still off bombing Tokyo with the Doolittle raid.
Good point.
So if you say Nimitz has 4 carriers, 2 of those are not available to him. So then he hears this report, maybe the Japanese are going after Port Moresby, and maybe we could get in their way. He decides to send the other 2 down to the Coral Sea to get in their way. He's committed everything he's got. He is at Pearl Harbor naked. That is a bold decision on his part to do that. So that's one. The other is that the Coral Sea, as we have mentioned earlier, is the first battle that demonstrates that aircraft carriers are the dominant offensive weapon of naval warfare in the Second World War. People knew it, or at least they suspected it prior to that. Now we know it's true. It's the first battle where the 2 opposing fleets never sight one another. All of the combat takes place from carrier-launched airplanes. So those are the 2 reasons why I think the Battle of the Coral Sea is an historical milestone.
And well, thank you for that. And in terms of its kind of historiography, is it, that's something that I love to talk about, and you've been, lecturing about this for a long time. Are we at a different point understanding this battle now than perhaps we were 30 or 40 years ago? Have we peaked yet, or is there still more analysis to be done on it, do you think?
It's interesting. People talk about revisionist history as if revising history was a bad thing.
It's a bad thing. I hate that.
We learn more all the time. We learn from information that's been hiding in somebody's attic or in someone's mind and is uncovered in an oral history that is recently played. So there's always more to know and more to learn. And so revising history is absolutely a good thing, as long as you're definitely not making stuff up. You get more information that allows you to see it more clearly than you had seen it before. So yes, there's been some movement in the way we understand what happened in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and I would not be entirely surprised if there were a bit more. Though, of course, the changes are going to diminish over time because these new sources of information have now been mined, and there may be more. I mean, I'll give you this example, that up until the 1970s, historians didn't even know about the code-breaking role of Joe Rochefort or anybody else. This was held top secret until it was finally released in 1970-72. And then all of a sudden, the view of the Coral Sea was changed dramatically. I don't think we'll see that much of a change again, but it does show you how changes to our understanding of the past can come about with the uncovering of new information.
And I think generally just being appreciative of kind of, in some ways, starting again. I think the older people who study World War II, and I include myself in that now, I think we come at it from the way we are presented some of these important figures in our childhood through movies and comics, your Pattons and Eisenhowers and Kings and Spruance and Housing, all these people there. And the younger people maybe don't have that baggage. And so they kind of just look at the facts, ma'am, as they would say on Dragnet, and they're looking at the reports, they're looking at the the naval documentation that was coming out after these battles, where they're analyzing it, and they're not quite so prejudiced as some of us are with our opinions of who we like and who we don't like, which is one of the things we're kind of saddled with as a Brit living in Normandy. The minute I mention Montgomery to Americans, I normally receive a tirade of opinion, and it's just one of those things that you have to kind of unravel that, because the younger Americans come over and they don't have that opinion of Montgomery or Eisenhower or Dempsey, and so I think that's something where the next generation hopefully will be able to look at it on a more level playing field.
Well, you're very kind to American visitors. My fear is that there are far too many American visitors who would respond by saying, "Who's Montgomery?"
Well, yeah, well, possibly, but that's another subject for the day. And by the way, I love your Operation Neptune book. It's one of my favorites on D-Day. But anyway, we will bring things to an end. So talking about Nimitz, you have, of course, your biography of Nimitz coming out is your next work. So I'm going to invite you right now to come back and talk about him, because I could even see your eyes light up when his name comes in. I mean, if we're talking about your affection for Fletcher, Nimitz clearly is in a state, on a pedestal all of his very own there. And I have to say, I think he's an extraordinary ability. And this, someone described him in the sidebar as a careful gambler, which seems like a kind of a paradox, but it's a cautionary gambler, which, it's a contradiction in terms, but I think would describe him admirably, which is a nice word I use there. But if you'd like to come back and talk about him next year when that book is read, that'd be fantastic.
Sure.
Brilliant. Well, I'll just remind people what we've got coming up, and I'll say goodbye in a second. So, folks, that has brought our examination of the Pearl Harbor 80th anniversary to an end. Battle of the Bulge, 3 weeks, starts on Monday with Dr. Peter Gaddick Adams is coming on first. We've got fantastic shows, 9th Air Force. We've got shows about the Lanzerath Ridge, all sorts of things coming up. And that we're going on with Battle of the Bulge right till the first week of January. So that's all we're talking about is the Winter War for the next 3 weeks. Of course, I'm taking time off for Christmas. As usual, folks, the links to Craig's book on Midway, Battle of Midway, are in the description below. I hold it up again, along with Shattered Sword. It's the two indispensable volumes on that battle. And say Coral Sea is covered in it. Do consider becoming a patron of our channel, share what we're doing on social media. And I'm going to say one last thing before I say goodbye to Greg, and that's go Navy. If I can't get behind the Navy on a day like today, then when the hell can I do it? So
yes,
go Navy.
I know. In about an hour and a half, the game will begin, and I will be watching, but we'll see.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for joining us, and good luck with all your work and your teaching. And I love the fact that you're still really passionate about talking about this subject, because you have been doing it for a fair number of years, and it is inspirational to historians that that people are still actively working of trying to find new things out, even when they've been doing it for a long time. If you feel you know everything, what would be the point of getting up in the morning and reading more reports? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying I'll see you all next week when we start talking about the Ardennes. Thank you, everybody, and have a good rest of your weekend. Cheers. Bye.